Okay, we're continuing from the book here, Prevent and Reverse Parkinson's Disease and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome. So we're on page 137, and I've gone through this. Like, if you know all my lectures on hypertension, I'm not going to give you any big new surprises, but if you want to hear it, I'll go through the real deal on hypertension. Okay, and then the first thing I say is that if you want to know anything about health, you have to realize that chronic conventional medicine is fake when it comes to the chronic Western diseases. They're grossly incompetent. They don't know what they're talking about. Pre-med education is fake. Medical school is fake. Now, I know when people go through allopath medical school, I went through allopath medical school. That's what it means to be an MD. There was kind of this attitude that allopath MDs are the real thing, the real doctors, that homeopathy is BS, chiropractor's BS, DO is BS. Everybody's BS except us, the MDs. That's what we were kind of taught. And then, you sort of thought you had this rigorous education, pre-med, calculus, physics, all this stuff. The reality is that's all BS. I say it's all BS because that has nothing to do with taking care of patients. It has nothing to do with what actually makes people sick and what gets them well. It's just a fake, okay? And like I said, it's like having a pretty girl stand in front of a car and you say, gee, if I buy the car, do I get the girl? And it's just nonsense, all right? Because here's a typical medical textbook. It'll tell you 95% of hypertension is idiopathic, of unknown cause, also called essential. Idiopathic means the doctor's an idiot and the patient's pathetic. Then they'll tell you, well, it's associated with aging. Seems like it's partly genetic. There's some really rare things that'll do it. Socioeconomic disparities. Again, I go through that because that's what they say for all the chronic diseases. It's horseshit. It's nonsense. It's dishonest. It's a disgrace. Okay? And it's real simple. Why do you get hypertension? Number one, why do you have a blood pressure? To pump blood to the top of your head. Okay? And what happens when the blood gets thick? If the blood is thick, you're pumping a milkshake instead of normal blood like water, so you have to pump a higher pressure. What makes blood thick? High-fat diets. The chylomicrons, the triglycerides, the LDL cholesterol, and also the leaky gut with amyloid clots. So when you're pumping thick blood, you got to put your pressure up. You eat high salt, you're going to vasoconstrict, tighten up your artery diameters. You got to pump a higher pressure. Chronic hypertension, a couple decades, you overstretch your ascending thoracic aorta. You lose the Windkessel effect, meaning the elastic recall from the elastic fibers. You can't replace them after you're in your 20s. So then you're stuck. You've lost your Windkessel effect, diminished diastolic flow. That means flow during the relaxation phase of left ventricle. So you're stuck with chronic systolic hypertension forever. Okay, that's how it goes. Whereas in plant-based countries, you got all these backward-ass, illiterate, third-world savages, okay? They don't have any high blood pressure, okay? So that's what I think is funny. You can go to the Yanomamo in South America at the junction of, Amazon and, Brazil and Venezuela, okay? These guys that they're going to raid the local village, to steal the women from the other tribe of Yanomamos, okay? They know more about preventing hypertension than the chief of internal medicine at Harvard. It's the truth. That's what I think is funny. I made a video called Who's the Better Doctor? And I got the Yanomamos with a bone in their nose going to go kidnap some women and they have no hypertension. And all these fat people being taken care of by the Harvard doctor, they're all hypertensive. Okay, and it's the same thing. The Tarahumara in northern Mexico, they don't have any hypertension. Whereas the Pima who came to the United States eating the Western diet, they're fat and sick and hypertensive. It's always the same thing. All right, well, you need to know that because what that means is you're going to have to solve this problem on your own. Good luck. The doctor's just going to put you on a bunch of pills that don't work very well. You're going to take them the rest of your life. They don't do much to lower your risk of stroke. Okay. You'd be better off going to a doctor in the 1700s who takes blood from you every couple of months. That'll lower your blood pressure more than... Anyways, okay. So, Walter Kempner was curing all these people with a low-fat vegan diets. Nathan Pritikin, John McDougall were curing 90% of them. The longer the person's had hypertension, the less likely you're going to be able to cure them 100%. Here's a typical paper. The Lancet is the journal. It's a real famous medical journal. 1929, author C.P. Donaldson. He's an English physician working in Africa. 1,800 consecutive adult black men, Kenyans, had their blood pressure checked when they were admitted to the hospital. None had hypertension, 0. Average blood pressure in a 60-year-old, 105/67. Okay, and a black guy. In the USA, 80% of black guys admitted to a hospital with hypertensive. The average European at that time, 60 years of age, 140 over 90, mild hypertension. So, it's true. It's obvious. Okay, I'll explain a little more why it's so obvious in a minute. But Richard Moore, famous hypertension researcher, said hypertension is just a symptom of eating a low K-factor diet. K-factor means potassium. He says nature gives us no choice. We must have enough potassium and magnesium for our cells to work properly. Anthropologists all over the world have noticed the same thing. Populations that eat a high K-factor diet, they never get hypertension. Virtually never. Okay. And here, it's the same. Epidemiology is the same everywhere. You look at the Kenyans, you look at the Okinawans in Japan, the Yanomamo, South America, Tarahumara, Papua New Guinea, Finland after Pekka got their fat down. They dramatically improved their blood pressure, lowered their risk of stroke and heart attack. So here's the map. In 1848, Mexican-American War, the Pima pulled into Arizona. They now eat the sad diet. They're all fat and sick. Tarahumara stayed in northern Mexico. Sierra means like a saw, so the Sierra Madre Mountains. They run around. They don't even have cars. They're skinny. They can run 100 miles in 2 days. Nathan Pritikin patterned himself after them, his whole Pritikin diet and everything. So here's the Pima, fat and sick, getting all the Western medications and surgeries. Here's the Tarahumara running 100 miles in 2 days. Average total cholesterol in the Tarahumara was 136, triglycerides 115. Their diet was 75% carbohydrate, 13% protein, 12% fat. Ruth Heydrich, the great triathlete marathoner, she went out and visited them, showed they were real. There's a guy named Christopher McDougall. He's not related to John McDougall as far as I'm aware. He wrote a book about him called Born to Run. Here's a Yanomamo getting ready to raid the neighboring tribe, kidnap some women. Despite the stress of that type of lifestyle, they don't have hypertension, showing that diet's more important than stress. Okay. My life is so boring. I never went on one of those adventures. Okay, here's hypertension, 200 over 100. The top number is the systolic, meaning in Greek contraction. The bottom number is diastolic, meaning in Greek relaxation. Okay, normal pressure is like 110 over 70. It depends on who you are. And, if you're healthy, you can be healthy like the Yanomamo and be 105 over 67. Some women will have blood pressures like 90 over 60, same as a baby. And if they feel good, that's good. Remember, P for plants and P for potassium. M for magnesium. It's in the center. Remember, M for mellow out. It mellows you out, lowers your blood pressure, makes you feel better. All right, so here's the Windkessel effect. The ascending thoracic aorta has a lot of elastic fibers normally, so after the heart contracts, it's stretched outward, and then when the heart relaxes during diastole, the elastic fiber recoil maintains good diastolic flow. And you want that. So you have a narrow pulse pressure, the distance between the systolic and the diastolic numbers. Once you trash those elastic fibers, they're not coming back after you're an adult. So you'll always end up having systolic hypertension because you got to get adequate amount of blood. The reason why you have the blood pressure is to get adequate amount of blood to the top of your brain, cerebral cortex. So if you don't have diastolic flow, elastic fibers generate. Your ascending thoracic aorta is like your second heart. Windkessel's a thing like you blow air on a fire to start the kindling. Looks like a little accordion. So when that thing's gone, you lost the Windkessel effect because you lost your elastic fibers. You're going to compensate for that by having chronically elevated systolic flow. The more decades that you're hypertension, the more you're going to get calcified, damaged arteries. So you're going to never be able to fully reverse it. So the sooner you start trying to reverse it, the better, which means eat a low-fat vegan diet. Okay, and you can see the vicious cycle. You're going to keep on, because you only perfuse the left ventricle well during diastole, but if you have crappy diastolic flow, you're going to keep on having to pump more blood during systole to compensate. Okay, now here's a look at the endothelial cells, the arterial lining cells. They're spindle-shaped in the direction of the long axis of flow. They can sense direction of flow. That's important, because when direction of flow is abnormal, they think there's a vascular injury. Basic blood flow is like my hand. It's like it's a parabolic velocity profile. It's called laminar flow. The red blood cells are in the center, traveling at the fastest velocity. The white blood cells are adjacent. And my thumbs are like the plasma that runs right next to the endothelial cells. If you stick the red cells together due to high-fat diet, LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, chylomicrons, then you're like pushing a submarine sandwich through these capillaries. Pressure has to go up. Normal red blood cells about 7 microns in diameter. Normal capillary is about 5 microns in diameter, so it's bigger than the capillary. That's why they'll have to fold back on themselves a little bit to get through that capillary. Now here's what happens when you form atherosclerosis. Remember, atherosclerosis is a blood clot. So it comes up the systolic flow, it hits the median divider. This is the common carotid artery in the neck. You can remember my forearm would be like the common carotid artery. My thumb's the internal carotid, it goes up into the brain. My fingers would be the external carotid, goes to the face. ECA has a bunch of branches. The ICA, internal carotid artery, has no branches. So anyways, the blood comes up the common carotid artery, hits the median divider, soft tissues between the bifurcating arteries, and then it bounces off, and there'll be some chaotic flow, that's called turbulent flow, and there'll be some retrograde eddy currents. Retrograde means backwards. Eddy current and retrograde, same thing. All right, well anyways, the point I'm saying is this excessive amount, due to the higher pressure systolic, creating an excessive amount of turbulent flow and an excessive amount of retrograde eddy currents, the endothelium of the internal carotid artery gets confused by this, and it sheds its antithrombotic glycocalyx, and sitting beneath that is the prothrombotic molecules like VCAM, vascular cell adhesion molecule, for example. And the red blood cells will adhere to that. You'll form a small clot. Atherosclerosis is a blood clot. This is where it forms. I've seen this countless thousands of times. Okay, I look at these things every day. So this is where it always happens. So that's the mechanism of forming atherosclerosis from hypertension. That's why hypertension is one of the biggest risk factors, hypertension and elevated blood cholesterol. So elevated blood cholesterol is a risk factor because it creates blood sludge. Hypertension is a risk factor because it injures the arteries. It hits them at such a high pressure, it disrupts the flow pattern, and that causes clot formation. You can remember that the mnemonic for the glycocalyx is 666, like the devil's number. 6 for 600. The height of the glycocalyx, antithrombotic component with the glycosaminoglycans on the core proteins. That's shed when there's abnormal flow. Sitting beneath it at 60 nanometers in height are those adhesive molecules. And then below that's the little plasma membrane phospholipid bilayer. That's 6 nanometers. So that's where the mnemonic comes from. 600 for the glycocalyx, antithrombotic, 60 for the adhesive molecules, and then 6 for the phospholipid bilayer. So anyways, you're going to form a blood clot right there. And then you end up in a steady state, often for over a decade. But the patient starts fading out, less endothelial nitric oxide, less other antithrombotic components to their blood. And that clot will get bigger, and it'll potentially occlude the carotid. It'll also potentially have little pieces knocked off, and they'll travel upward into the brain. That's called the embolize. They travel distally in an artery, and those can cause a stroke, little embolic strokes. That's real common. I see that every day. Okay. So that's why hypertension is such a major risk factor. And that's why it gets much worse after you lost the Windkessel effect. All right, now here's a plasma membrane, sodium, potassium, ATP pump. You need ATP to pump the sodium out of the cell against a gradient because the concentration is 10 times higher of sodium in the extracellular space than it is inside the cell. Remember how I taught you how to remember that? When God created the earth, he created life in the ocean water. And then phospholipid bilayers enclosed a circular cell. In order to have any life in that cell, you had to pump out the salt water, which means pump out the sodium chloride. You also had to pump out the calcium because you got a lot of calcium in seawater because the salt water rinses against the limestone, the calcium carbonate limestone, rinsing calcium into the water. Okay, so with life on Earth, you always have corresponding ions inside and outside a cell. So potassium is high inside a cell, 1 plus ion, cation is positively charged, and that corresponds to sodium outside the cell. You're also going to have high magnesium inside the cell, that's a 2 plus divalent cation, and it's going to be balanced by calcium outside the cell. That's also 2 plus divalent cation, all right? So that's how you can always remember it. God created life on Earth in the ocean with salt water, and the salt water rinses against the calcium carbonate, so you're always going to have high calcium in the extracellular space. So salt water, seawater is the same thing as extracellular space. You have to know that. You have to know that because if you know that, all of this neurophysiology, ion membrane, everything will be easy once you grasp that and you lock that in, okay? All right, so when you pump sodium out of a cell, you're pumping against a gradient, therefore you need ATP. You need magnesium to hang on to the second and third phosphate so they don't break apart prematurely, okay? You're pumping more sodium out, 3 positive charges, only bringing in 2 positive charges, leading to a net negative charge gradient on the inner part of the plasma membrane of a brain cell, of a neuron. Okay? At least half of the cell's energy is going for this pump, meaning it's super important. Why is it so important? Because it's a battery. It's the electrical power of the cell. Everything else comes from that along the plasma membrane. The NACA exchanger, Na for sodium, Ca for calcium. Natrium means sodium in Latin. Calcium right here. This is how you pump calcium out of the cell. And you need to do that because calcium is the activator of the cell. It makes it do stuff. Okay, that's going to become real relevant. So this is really just the introduction to this concept. I'll show you the key slide here in a moment. This is basically how, this guy wrote a great book here, Richard Moore, about high blood pressure solution. It's a great introduction to ion pumps, okay? It's a fantastic book. He spent his whole life researching that, his whole adult career. All right, where does magnesium come from? It comes from the center of chlorophyll. So here's magnesium. This is what magnesium is all about. Magnesium's 2+ charge enables it to hang on to the negative charges of the phosphates in ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. 1, 2, 3. That's why it's tri as in 3 phosphates. And they want to break apart. It's a high energy bond. So the magnesium's like, whoa! That's why I call magnesium the hero amongst the ions. Okay? And where does magnesium come from? It sits in the center of chlorophyll. You eat the plant leaf, you get the chlorophyll. Okay? Have a salad. Enjoy your magnesium. Magnesium helps keep arteries open. And now you're going to learn about K factor. This is a really important concept. K factor is the ratio of potassium to sodium. K is a symbol for potassium because it means kalium. Okay? Anything that's got live tissue in it, that's got intact cells, is going to be high in potassium. That's why you want to eat whole foods, because the cells are intact and you get that high potassium, high magnesium from meat and plant foods. Okay? On the other hand, if you eat processed food, they've grinded out that processed food, and then they rinse it with water and solvents. They rinse away all the potassium and the magnesium, so processed food is very low in potassium. And then they throw salt on it to flavor it and preserve it. So processed food is always really high in sodium, very low in potassium and magnesium, whereas a real food is going to be high in potassium. That's important to know. That's one of the ways you can tell what's going on when you read a food label. All right, then you got to have a constant K plus Na plus inside the cell. You can't have the osmolality go too high inside a cell, otherwise water would rush in and the cell would burst. Okay, because of these fixed constants, what this means is you can't bullshit your body. You can't lie to your body about how much sodium and potassium you're eating. It's going to change your cell concentrations. There's nothing you can do about that. There is no medical surgical bullshitology that can change that. You need to know that. That's why you have to eat the plant foods, or you're putting your cells at a disadvantage for their function. Okay? That's just a physiological fact. All right, let me show you a little more detail how a cell really works. Okay? When calcium is high in the cell, whatever that cell is made to do, it will do it. Its main job. If it's a neuron, it'll release its neurotransmitter. If it's a pancreatic beta islet cell, it'll release its insulin. If it's a vascular smooth muscle cell, it'll contract. Okay? Whatever that cell does, high cytoplasm calcium, it'll do it. And that's why I joke that calcium amongst ions is like mama, a big, bitchy, bossy matriarch that says, "You, do what I say," tells the kid. "Pick up the dog crap. You, put the dishes away. You lazy-ass husband, clean the garage," okay? So when calcium comes in, that's big mama matriarch bossing everybody around. That's what calcium is. Remember, that's what calcium does. It's the big, bossy matriarch who is not reasonable, okay? She's a bitch, and whatever she says, you got to do it, all right? That's calcium. Remember that, and you'll always understand calcium, and you'll understand why everything in a cell is based on calcium. You want the cell to be activated and start doing stuff, you bring calcium in. You want the cell to shut off and rest, you get that calcium out of the cytoplasm. That's the only way to do it. You have to know that, because everything comes down to what's happening with calcium. Okay, everything else is just set up to handle calcium. Everything revolves around calcium. Calcium is the center of attention, the power broker, the aristocrat, the boss of the cell. Potassium is like dear old dad, working his ass off, trying to bring home the bacon, pay the bills, okay? And then magnesium's like the hero, okay? Like I just told you, holding down the fort with the phosphates, all right? Remind me of like Charlton Heston, holding the horses in the chariot races in Rome. All right, and then I describe sodium as being like the angry poor. It wants to break into the cell. It wants to break into the cell. And they let it come into the cell to do work. but then they use its gradient to pump the calcium out. So you can allow 3 sodiums to come in, and that enables you to pump out 1 calcium. And that's how you get calcium out of the cell, through the NACA exchanger. It's often abbreviated NCX. And it works like that for other things too. It's important for the NHX is the sodium proton exchanger pump. So when you bring a sodium into the cell, you can then pump out a proton. That becomes really important for glycolytic metabolism, anaerobic metabolism. We're going to come back to that again, so you're going to want to know that. That's going to be really important in chronic fatigue syndrome. Okay, it's really important in cancer too. Okay, here's basically the different ionic gradient concentrations. In the extracellular matrix, ECM, sodium is high, 140, because that's the extracellular space, like I was talking about, like salt water. Potassium's low. Calcium is high. Calcium's super high. It's like 10,000 times higher in the extracellular space than it is inside the cell. Okay. Now, if we look inside the cell, the vertical column here, we'll see that sodium is low, about 14, so it's 10 times higher in the extracellular space. And calcium inside the cells, like I said, 10,000 times lower. These are nanometers. These are micrometers. So it's 10,000 times lower inside the cell than it is outside the cell. Okay, and that means you always need ATP to pump calcium out of a cell, because you're always pumping against a gradient. That's going to become real important too for cognitive decline, all these other mechanisms. Okay, now we're getting into another big academic orgasm. Okay, so academic orgasm here. All right, fruits tend to have like 100 to 500 times as much potassium as they do sodium. So if you eat fruits, that helps you to maintain a good blood pressure. Very, very good for you. Very healthy. Okay. Now, if you eat starches tend to be about 15 to let's say 20 to 60. Okay, so white rice got K factor 60. Brown rice, K factor 50. Green beans, K factor 40. Peas, K factor 50. Beans, lentils, 50. Potatoes, 40. One of the lowest ones would be like a sweet potato is only 14. That's still great though. Okay. Now let's look at greens, your veggies. Veggies are in the ballpark of around as low as 5, as high as 15. So veggies aren't that high, but they're still good. You got to be above 5 or you get yourself in trouble. So when you look at ground beef, meat, it's only 4. That's bad, but it's not super bad, but it's bad. And now let's start looking at these really processed foods. They're all really super bad. Soy burgers, 1.6 K factor, bad. Cheerios, 1.2, bad. Cheetos, disaster, 0.14. Less than 1. Potato chips, 0.9. Special K, supposedly a healthy cereal, 0.06. That's dog crap. That's really bad. Okay, these numbers are really bad. That's why you don't ever want to eat processed food. And you can tell, you just look at the package. If you see that the sodium is higher than the potassium, you know it's a processed food. Okay, you know it's bad. So there it is. Fruits 100 to 500, starches 20 to 50, veggies 5 to 20. Those numbers are worth remembering. That just reminds you, you don't need to know them exactly, but you need to know if you want to prevent hypertension, it's good to eat fruits. It's good to eat starch. And you also want to eat veggies, not only for the K factor. Veggies give you the nitrate precursors to make nitric oxide, so they really help a lot too to prevent high blood pressure. Okay, processed food is screwed. You don't ever want that. And like I said, your body was designed by God, and He's a lot smarter than any doctor, and He designed it to eat a lot of potassium, eating plant foods, getting your magnesium as well, getting your precursor nitrates, having a high K factor in your diet. Our ancestors probably ate about 10 to 20 K factor, whereas nowadays we eat very, very low K factors. That's why most people are hypertensive, middle age, and older. Here's the whole oral nitric oxide cycle. You eat the plant nitrates, which means NO3. This should be an I right here for nitrite. The bacteria in the back of your tongue convert it to nitrite, NO2. Your stomach acid converts it to nitric oxide. It goes into your blood. It's a gas, and then nitric oxide can bind to the hemoglobin inside your red blood cells. Go for a free ride, so it does not degrade itself, and then it can come off, and it'll vasodilate wherever it comes off at. That's how it travels around the body systemically. Mouthwash with fluoride toothpaste, they're all bad. They kill the bacteria in the back of the tongue. So brushing your teeth with fluoride can cause high blood pressure, because once you lose this, you lose the oral nitric oxide pathway here. Nathan Bryan, he's sort of like the world expert on nitric oxide. He gives lectures on this all the time. Caldwell Esselstyn lectures about this as well. Good to know. If you take acid blockers in the stomach, that can block this conversion step from NO2 to NO. Okay, not good. Oh, this is just showing the old graphs of like Peter Quo, the cardiologist in Pennsylvania, and basically, if you're eating sat fat, and then Meyer, Friedman, Ray Rosenman showed the same thing. If you're eating sat fat, or if you're eating PUFAs, omega-6 oils, you stick your red blood cells together, blood slugs, rouleau formation, and they'll measure your blood lipids every 30 minutes. And it's even worse with the PUFAs, the omega-6 cooking oils, than it is with the high sat fat meal. You'll drop your oxygen delivery, like 15-20%. Roy Swank in a hamster brain measured up to 30%. So you're dropping oxygen to your tissue, and tissue that's probably already compromised by mitochondrial inhibitors, by atherosclerosis, thick capillary basement membranes from diabetes, and fibrosis of arterial walls from hypertension. And then you're going to stick your red cells together with fat. Not smart. You're going to drop your oxygen delivery to your tissues. You're going to potentially push that into anaerobic metabolism, potentially activate hypoxia-inducible factor, HIF. And you don't want to go into anaerobic metabolism unnecessarily. You also want your immune cells to be able to freely come back into oxidative metabolism. If you trap them into anaerobic metabolism due to hypoxia from poor oxygen delivery, you could be stuck in inflammation. Okay, we'll come back to that later, but I'm telling you, it's a big deal. And like I said, the PUFAs were even worse than the sat fat. They're all bad. All fat is a bad. There's no such thing as good fats. I tell you that based on a lot of research and study. That's what Nathan Pritikin said after a thorough review of the literature. Okay, the higher the hematocrit, the more the red blood cells stick together. That's why people sometimes will donate blood. When I go for a blood draw, let's say I'm going just to get my cholesterol checked, I'll tell them to pull off a couple tubes and discard them because I want to lower my hematocrit a little bit. I don't like donating entire units. I don't even want to donate a half a unit, even though a lot of people do that. Gregory Sloop used to do that, and he was like the world expert at atherosclerosis. But make sure you're hydrated first. You can get quite lightheaded. All right, when you eat a high-fat meal, your blood becomes radio-opaque. Your plasma becomes opaque. You can no longer see through it. So it happens pretty fast. It's pretty obvious. There's a picture of that in the movie Game Changers. This is a little seesaw diagram saying these are all the things that improve your blood pressure. These are all the things that make it worse. So getting your sleep so you're not stressed out, having a major religion so you're not stressed out, the green plants, the nitrates, the plant foods having the potassium, the magnesium, the dietary fiber, all of that stuff improves blood pressure. And then there's all the stuff that makes it worse. So let's see if I got any more slides. That's it for hypertension. I hope you found that helpful. So the bottom line is the main things that cause high blood pressure are high-fat diets and high-sodium diets. And this is well known, and it's obvious, and it makes sense. It's actionable information to keep you healthy. So there it is. All right, hope you found that helpful.